Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Face Your Ears podcast. I'm joined once again by the beloved and admirable Justin Hochella. How you doing, sir?
That is I. I'm doing quite well, Rich. How are you? The astute, beloved, erudite, and talented Richard Bozic. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's a bit hot. I have the AC on. I don't know if you hear it.
I have a lawnmower in the background here, so we got all the summer sounds here today in the Face Your Ears podcast.
Hope everyone out there is enjoying the weather. I wanted to bring up the fact that we are now on YouTube. At least the audio version of the podcast is now on YouTube. I think Google stopped hosting podcasts and gave us a notice to switch it on over to YouTube for those of you who like to listen that way.
Yes, the machine marches on. Google Podcasts has been crushed into a digital paste.
Yes. And YouTube once again swallows up another...
Sipped up the slurry and absorbed it into its mighty form.
Justin, tell me, how's it going today?
Yeah, it's going well. I've been producing a lot of music lately, which has been a lot of fun. Renovations here at the studio are hopefully going to be finishing up in the next few weeks. But yeah, I'm doing really well, and I'm looking forward to today's episode in which we are talking about a topic that I love, effects. But not just any effects. Vocal effects. And while there are a seemingly infinite array of effects, we'll be focusing on three of the most popular effects used in vocal recording production: vocoder, pitch shifter, and Autotune.
Is vocoder really one of the most popular?
Oh, yes.
I want some vocoder on my voice. I've heard that many a time in the studio.
I will say vocoder is truly one of those effects that people hear all the time and they don't even realize it. But
oh, wow. Okay. Well, let's dive in. What is vocoder?
Vocoder is what I would describe as the classic singing robot type of sound. For those of you that grew up with the Transformers, it's the more than meets the eye sound that they sing in the opening credits.
Near and dear to my heart, that sound.
Yes, but vocoder is basically taking two sounds and sort of mashing them together, and that's typically like a string sound or some sort of synthesized organ type of sound, something like that, with a voice. And so you kind of mash those together and you get that kind of singing robot kind of sound.
You mean if my voice started off normal and then I really started to think about Transformers a lot, and then eventually my voice would sound like a robot, just like Optimus Prime?
I'm not saying that that's impossible, but that may not be exactly how a vocoder works. But I've been proven wrong before.
All right. Well, let's give a little sample of vocoder before and after. Here you go.
Amazing. Incredible. Experience. Amazing. Incredible. Experience.
All right, so there we heard just a simple vocal recording before a vocoder was applied, and then after, and you can hear a stark difference, of course, and you get that kind of singing robot kind of effect. And it's really cool because there are so many different parameters you can change to tweak that sound. It's almost this infinite palette of sound that you can play with.
How did we get here?
You know, it's really interesting. The vocoder, the history of the vocoder was actually an invention from a gentleman by the name of Homer Dudley. And Homer started working on this vocoder idea. I think they called it a vocal coder back then or something like that. It was like the late 1920s. And it was actually something that was used in World War II for encrypting messages.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's kind of its history and where it started. But fast forward to the 1970s and 80s and into today, and it's been one of the more popular vocal effects in all kinds of different music. When you look at a vocoder, there's a lot of important settings. For instance, you have bandwidth. The bandwidth allows you to manipulate the frequency bands being used to process the signal. So that can allow you to either widen or narrow the frequency bands, which will change the quality of the sound you're hearing. Something, more thin versus thicker, so you can play with that. Noise is another really important setting in a vocoder. When you introduce noise into the mix on a vocoder effect, it typically allows it to be more intelligible because the sibilants and so forth get caught by the noise and are more enunciated. So noise is another element in there. And the basic premise of a vocoder is that there's two signals. There's a carrier signal, which is usually strings or an organ sound, some sort of synthesizer like pad, something like that. And then there's a modulator, which is by and large the voice, which is what we're talking about here today. So, those are kind of the elements that comprise the vocoder and some things to take into consideration when using one.
So you mentioned that the modulator is usually the voice. I take it that this is not only for vocals?
That's right. Usually when you're using a vocoder, you're holding down chords and then, speaking or singing, it doesn't really matter, into the microphone. But imagine instead of a voice, you had drums, like a drum loop or a drum machine. And so instead of the voice sort of imprinting on the chords that you're playing or the notes that you're playing, instead you'd have the rhythm of the drums. Really anything. It's not really limited to drums or voice. You can use literally anything. Rhythmic kind of sounds are usually better because they're sort of imprinting on the sustained chord, but it's something I've used in production that sounds really cool. It's a really neat trick to try if you happen to have a vocoder handy.
You know what I really enjoy about vocoder? The way I've used it is it's a built-in effect in my Mod X8 Yamaha keyboard, and you could plug a microphone directly into the keyboard and then use the keys on the keyboard while you are singing something or saying something, and you can make the vocoder basically put out a chord of this robotic sound while you're generating sound with your voice.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily have to sing it either. You could speak something and just sustain it, and then as you play the keys on the keyboard, the vocoder will come out using those notes that you're playing.
Yeah. Imagine your voice hitting that chord or that sound. It's almost like a membrane, right, that your voice is butting up against. And every time you do that, say it's a C major membrane, it comes through as a C major chord, but it sounds like the words that you're saying. And then you change that to an F major chord, and now it's sounding like you're talking as if it's an F major chord. It's a really cool effect.
Yeah, it's really fun. Now, let's move on to pitch shifter.
Pitch shifter is relatively straightforward. So it's an effect that allows us to raise or lower the pitch of a signal. In this case, someone's voice. And it's a pretty commonly used effect, especially in today's music. I hear it quite a bit, either pitched down an octave to give kind of voice, or it's pitched up an octave, which gives us that really high chipmunk voice. So yeah, it's a pretty cool thing, usually blended, I would say, with the regular vocal, but not always. It's really up to the producer and the artist's palette and their taste.
Well, let's give a sample of that. Here we go.
Amazing. Incredible. Experience. Amazing. Incredible. Experience.
All right, so that was pitch shifter. And so with a pitch shifter, the controls are generally pretty straightforward. So one of them that you have is blending the dry versus wet. We've talked about this concept before. Dry is just the regular signal, unaffected, Wet is the affected signal, so in this case, the pitch shifted signal. And so you can blend that to be, anywhere from 100% dry with no signal to 50-50, half and half, pitch shifted and unaffected, or 100% wet with no dry signal. And then another one is pitch itself. Usually this is in semitones, like on a keyboard, but not always, or not exclusively, I should say. We're talking half steps. Sometimes you can also adjust the pitch by cents, which are like even finer adjustments. So you can even get a little crazy with the pitch there and make it sort of out of tune or slightly off from the source signal itself.
Something that has been coming up a lot lately in the past 20 years is Autotune. Can we talk a little bit about Autotune, and can you kind of clarify the difference between Autotune and what you just talked about, pitch shift?
Autotune effectively is listening to the signal, the voice, and it is detecting what pitch it is quote unquote hearing or analyzing, I guess in this case. And it uses computational algorithms to adjust the pitch to a specific note. And so I was reading about this, and the inventor of it kind of got the idea when his wife said, it would be so great if there was something that would just automatically tune my voice as I was singing and I didn't have to go back and re-record. Yes. And so that's basically what we're talking about here.
As a matter of fact, the guy who did that worked for the oil industry, and the technology for Autotune basically was derived from sonar technology that he was using for finding oil in deep waters. And somehow he was able to retool that. And I think he teamed up with, I don't know how you pronounce it, Antares Audio. And that was when the first Autotune plugin was officially released. Autotune has kind of become synonymous with pitch correction, kind of like Googling something, right? Autotune was the specific name for the plugin, but what we're doing is we're using pitch correction.
It was, I think, meant to be a utility in its inception. In other words, something that was meant to correct the pitch of someone singing. And what actually happened, as we've heard countless times in popular music, is that it's more of a creative effect now. Oftentimes we'll hear it as sort of a different version of a singing robot, I guess, than the vocoder. But yeah, let's check it out. So here's a before and after example of using Autotune.
Oh, 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 yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, 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 yeah, 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 yeah.
So there we go. That was Autotune, probably a very familiar sound for our listeners. And Autotune first showed up in the scene in the late 90s, and its sort of extreme usage was popularized by Cher in her song Believe. And if you listen to that song, you can hear this sort of robotic, almost perfect synthesizer-esque sounding voice in that song. And so when we look at a typical Autotune plugin, be it something that is built into our DAW or something that we purchase third party, there are a lot of different parameters that we can tweak. One of those is time. And this is the aspect of the plugin that gives us this really hard robotic sound. If we actually take the time down, and what do we mean by time? And so it's basically the time it takes for the plugin to correct the audio or like, shift it, and it makes the effect come in faster or slower. If we're making that happen really, really fast, faster than a human voice could do, it ends up sounding like a robot. So if we want it to be more natural, we want to slow that down, like the human voice can shift pitch in a more gradual, slower fashion, at least compared to a computer. When we make that fast, we get that sort of, robot kind of voice. And again, with Autotune, we have dry and wet. So I talked about that with Pitch Shifter, where you get that sort of blend between the affected sound versus the unaffected sound. And then another one with Autotune is key signature. So let's say you're singing in the key of C major. Well, you'd want to set your Autotune plugin to C major so that it knows sort of the ballpark of what the pitches are or they should be. If you're way out of tune and you're almost singing in C sharp, what it's going to do is analyze the audio and force it to be into the C major. And again, going back to that time I mentioned, so if you're really out of tune and it's needing to force the audio, the time is going to be how quickly it shifts the pitch down to the right pitch. So again, that's going to give it more of that robotic kind of sound.
Yeah. I imagine Autotune was, in its inception, originally supposed to be used as something as a time saver in the studio, something that's surgical, like you're singing a phrase and there's one note that's off and you get in there and you do a little bit of correction.
Yeah.
Yes, there are some people who might abuse this or overuse this, one because they might just not want to take the time to rehearse properly, or perhaps don't have the money, the funds to be able to pay for more time in the studio. Or, unfortunately, sometimes people just have a lot of trouble. They just can't match pitch as well. They need to work that skill more, and so they need to implement more of this kind of thing to make the song come out right. A lot of people like to criticize modern pop singers as, oh, they're all auto-tuning. But when it's done, it's kind of like an industry standard now. When it's done properly, you almost don't even notice it because it's something that's very subtle and the technology is getting better and better. The intent is mainly to save time and my thought is, are you going to sit there and do 50 takes of that melody until you get it? Because what can happen is you could tire yourself out while you're recording, so you could also kind of get more done if you get in there and there's one little spot that needs a little bit of touch up, and there you go. Some people are ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater and be like, anyone who uses Autotune is just sucks as a singer, and it's like something they use to discredit some singers. But I know singers who would blow your mind, who sing really well and the pitch is fantastic. Still, when they go into the studio, the head producer or whoever they're working with, whoever's funding the operation or whatever, insists, they say, run it through the box because they want the sound to be in alignment with what is popular right now. Mm-hmm. So to Justin's point of where he's talking about it as a general kind of effect, that's kind of where it's at, it seems, right now. There might be some people who are using it to hide other things, but it's hard to tell, and it's getting harder and harder to tell. And now, as AI creeps into the picture, AI is probably going to change the game with regard to this effect as well, I imagine.
I'm actually taking a look right now at the Wikipedia article on Autotune, and one fun fact here is that at the 51st Grammy Awards in early 2009, the band Death Cab for Cutie made an appearance wearing blue ribbons to protest against the use of Autotune in the music industry. I just read that and laugh because it's like, knowing where we are now and what we've just talked about, it's like, that's so absurd. Like, it's kind of like we've talked about before with synthesizers. When those were first hitting the scene, people were freaking out. And, I hope that's the case with AI. I really do. That we're going to look back on our AI episodes and laugh because we're like, oh, man, we were so wrong. But, it's interesting just in general, like how disruptive technology can be in regards to music. And one thing that strikes me is how artists will take something where the initial intent was one thing and they'll do something completely different with it. Like a band I listen to that not a lot of people listen to, but I love, is Skinny Puppy. And so Skinny Puppy is an industrial band and they make very brash music. And one of the things they often will do is completely abuse delay. So one of the things you're quote unquote not supposed to do with delay is crank the feedback, which gives you basically like infinite delays. But when you do that, you get very brash, very big, crazy sounds. And so they figured out a way to use that creatively. That thing you're not supposed to do, they figured out a way to use it in a way that's creative. And that's exactly what we're looking at with Autotune is, people used it in a way that it, quote, wasn't supposed to be used, making people sound like robots. And people were like, you know what? This is cool. I'm going to use this as my signature sound. Like T-Pain is probably one of the most famous artists that uses Autotune. I mean, that guy's whole brand is basically Autotune.
I heard the guy can really sing, though.
Yeah.
It was just used as an effect.
Yeah. So, it's just an interesting thing to look at. But yeah, that's a little bit about Autotune.
Excellent. So just to recap, today we talked about vocoder, pitch shift, and Autotune, and we gave you some examples. Thank you, Justin. Thank you for taking the time today and meeting up and talking about these effects. I'm looking forward to diving into more effects down the line.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's always fun to talk about effects. There's so many to talk about and so many different avenues of production and recording. So it was great to unpack some of this with you, Rich. And to our listeners, let us know on social media if you liked this episode, and we'll continue to publish more like this. Thanks again, everyone, for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.
I wonder what my voice would sound like if I put on all of the effects at once. Let's hear it.
Thank you for listening to the Face Your Ears podcast. If you found this episode entertaining and informative, be sure to share and leave a review. Also, check us out on social media and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. For more information related to our podcast, head on over to www.faceyourears.com. Links can be found in the show description. And remember, whether you're a musician just starting out or a seasoned professional looking to talk shop, it's time to face your ears.